My name is Giovanni Cajaiba Santana. I am associate professor at the International University of Monaco, and I also teach in the Master in Sustainability and Innovation Management. One of the classes that I teach in the Master is the Project and Change Management. And one of the topics that we talk about during this class is carbon accounting. So today in this masterclass, I'm going to give you a brief uh, um, picture of what carbon accounting is. And this is a topic that we developed throughout 3 or 4 sessions in class. So today is just that at the end of this class, you were able to know what carbon account is and have some hints about how to calculate it. So to start with, I know that you guys have heard carbon account, the expression, the terminology of carbon account, because we talk a lot about this. It's an important subject in sustainability today. But what is carbon account? What's carbon accounting about? Maybe you have seen that through different words, to different names. So sometimes we can heard about carbon emission reporting, carbon auditing, greenhouse gas emissions inventory, greenhouse gas accounting, carbon footprint, or carbon account. In general, those terms, they represent roughly the same thing. So what is all of this? What is carbon account? A simple definition is that the carbon account is a process of measuring greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with something. So it can be an organization. So most of the time, a company, a private company, that's the case that we work with students during my class. But organization can be a school, can be a non-profit organization, can be a church, right? It can be a product. So we have calculated the carbon footprint of different products. So, for example, in front of me now, I have a computer, a laptop, and we know that roughly for a laptop that is bought here in Europe, there are around 300 kilograms of CO2 associated with producing, manufacturing, and distributing that computer. So this is the carbon footprint of my laptop. It can be an activity. So today I'll give you a quick example of calculating the carbon footprint of a specific activity, but also it can be a region. We can calculate the carbon footprint of a city, of a whole country, or only a person. You can calculate your own carbon footprint. And it will take into account all the CO2 or all the greenhouse gas emissions associated to everything that you did in a certain period. Most of the time, it's 1 year. So everything that you bought, there are CO2 emissions associated to that, the use of your car, the use of public transportation, how many flights you have taken in a year, and all of this is part of your carbon account. And at the end of the day, you will have a number that measures the amount of greenhouse gas emitted for you in 1 year. But what are greenhouse gases? I know that you have at least an idea of what I'm talking about, but the greenhouse gases, uh, they are gases that trap heat in Earth atmosphere. If you have a more technical term, they absorb infrared radiation from Earth. And the idea is quite simple. No? What we call the greenhouse effect. It's the fact that the solar radiation came from the sun. So this is why we have a certain temperature in average in Earth. And thanks to the greenhouse effect, some of that heat stays on Earth. If it wasn't the case, we couldn't have life in Earth as we have today. Now, look at the temperature on the surface of the moon. Moon, there is no greenhouse effect, so the moon didn't absorb just a little bit of the heat that comes from the sun. If you look to Mars, the average temperature on the surface of Mars is minus 60 degrees Celsius. So we have life in Earth thanks for the greenhouse effect. The problem is with the human activity, we have been putting lots of gases in the atmospheres that increase that capacity of the atmosphere to retain heat. And this is increasing the temperature of the Earth. This is what we call the greenhouse effect caused by human activity. Human activity that produce those greenhouse gases. But the question that can be legitimated is the fact of the greenhouse. Is that warming real, and who causes it? Well, greenhouse effect, it's a real thing, and we are absolutely sure about the fact that it's caused by human activity. If you look for the IPCC, which is the main reference authority about scientific studies regarding global warming, if you look on all the reports, there are 6 reports that have been published so far. On the first report, the IPCC said that the global warming is plausible. Now, we knew that at that moment that there was something happening with the temperature in the Earth, but we have no clear attribution for human activity. And as we move forward, in 1995, the report said that it suggests that is a discernible human influence on global climate. In 2001, we says that it's likely due, the human activity is likely due to the increasing in greenhouse houses. In 2007, we said that's very likely. Very likely, we're talking about 90% of certitude. Then in 2014, it's extremely likely. And in 2021, which was the last edition, it's unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. So global warming, it's a certitude today. It's like 2 plus 2, it's 4. It's like the Earth is not flat, and global warming, it exists, it's a fact, and we are certainly that it's caused by human activities. But which are those greenhouse gases? Well, most of them, now 80% of the greenhouse gases that you have in atmosphere today are carbon dioxide, CO2, almost 80%. The second place comes methane, and then we have nitrous oxide. And those 7 gases are the gases that we use to calculate the greenhouse account or footprint. And we'll see that since 80% is CO2, that's why we usually use the term carbon. No? It's not only about carbon. It's not really only carbon, because you're talking about CO2, so carbon dioxide. But this explains the fact that use this terminology of carbon. And the most accurate is to talk about greenhouse gases. And we can easily understand the place of carbon or CO2 on that. If you look the last 200 years of human history, we can explain, at least partly, all the development, all the economic development, all the technological development that you have seen after the Industrial Revolution, based on the fact that you had access to a lot of energy that was not expensive at all. And what kind of energy I'm talking about? I'm talking about the energy that came from fossil fuels. If you look in this graphic, in the last 70 years, there is a huge increase in the total use of fossil fuels. So we're talking about coal, oil, and gas. Today, almost 8% of all the primary source of energy that used in this planet came from fossil fuels. And we can see there is a little increase in the use of renewables, in the use of nuclear, that's low carbon, but we're still hugely dependent on fossil fuels. And when we burn fossil fuels, we are emitting CO2. And this is a huge impact on the global warming. So when you look at the sources of greenhouse emissions, we see that energy accounts for almost 3/4 of that. So it's easily, you can realize that energy in the use of fossil fuels, it's a really important element. in global warming today. So it's important to have metrics that allows us to calculate the amount of greenhouse that we emit in our activities, especially economic activities today. We have to rethink the way that we do economy, the way that we produce things, the way that we consume things. In order to do that, we needed a measure. How can we measure that? And this is what greenhouse gases account, your carbon footprint or carbon account is about. Okay. So everything, this phenomenon is quite new. Everything started during the 90s when we start to have this awareness about the need to calculating the amount of greenhouses that are emitted throughout our activities. Even though global warming is something that is in scientific debate for more than 100 years, right? But we need this universally accepted framework to calculate, to measure, and to manage greenhouse emissions. And it was only in 1997 that we had the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development that got together in order to propose a way of calculating that. So in 2001, we had the first edition of what is called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It's a protocol with specific ways of calculating greenhouse emissions in this accounting of greenhouse emissions, right? So today, the greenhouse gas protocol is the most widely used and international accepted accounted, even though there are others. I can cite here, for example, all the protocols that are parts of the ISO 14000 series. You just have to know that those protocols exist, and today the most used is the greenhouse gas protocol, okay? So, in order to understand how we calculate that, we need to understand some specific accounting fundamentals. The first one is what we call emission factors. The emission factors is just something that we can calculate. Most of the time, we calculate in laboratory. It's linked to the amount of greenhouse that are emitted when we do a certain activity. And those emission factors is not something that we will calculate. We can find them in some specific databases. All over the internet, we have good databases. Some of them are free, some of them are paid, but you can easily get those emission factors that will be used to calculate the amount of CO2 or the amount of CO2 equivalent that is emitted in a certain activity production, and will help us to have a figure of the amount of greenhouse that was emitted. The second fundamental is what we call the global warming potential. Uh, I've shown you that we have 7 different gases, right? And those gases, they have different effects on the atmosphere. So if you take, for example, methane, methane, it is around 28 or 24 times more it can trap heat in the atmosphere 24 times more than CO2. So if you take 1 ton of methane, it's the equivalent of 24 tons of CO2 because those gases, they have different global warming potential. But at the end of the day, we'll bring everything to one single measure, which is CO2. So CO2 is kind of the currency or the main metric that we use to calculate emissions. So the third point here, it's a little bit large acronym, but the idea is quite easy. It's metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. We bring everything to the unit measure of CO2. So we'll say that CO2 has a emission factor of a global warming potential of 1, and the methane has a global warming potential of 24, for example. Okay, and the carbon footprint, especially for organizations, will be the amount of greenhouse that was emitted in 2 different scopes, scope 1, 2, and 3. And I will talk about that in a couple of minutes, right? So just to synthesize the idea here, you have the amount of greenhouse gases that was emitted in different sources. For example, I'll show you an example of the amount of greenhouse gas emitted when we burn 1 gallon of gasoline. Then we have emission factors. Those emission factors, they are linked to each gas, and they are used to bring everything to the same measure that we call CO2 equivalent. It can be on grams or kilograms or tons of CO2 equivalent. Usually, as I show you, it appears in metric tons. It's just to differentiate the fact that in United States and United Kingdom, they have different measures for tons. So when you talk about metric tons, we're talking about 1,000 kilograms of something. This is what metric tons is about. So here we have an example. You have 1 gallon of gasoline and you burn it. So what is the amount of greenhouse gases that came out, that are emitted from the combustion of 1 gallon of gasoline? Well, we measure that in laboratory. And we can say that the emission factor of burning 1 gallon of gasoline is the figure down there, 8.81 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. How do you get, how did you get to this figure? Well, first thing, we know the emission factors for CO2 in gasoline. So when you burn 1 gallon of gasoline, you have 8.78 kilograms of CO2 that was emitted, right? But there is also emissions of methane. It's a small amount. It's roughly 0.4 milligrams. And we also have nitrous oxide. It's 0.08 milligrams of nitrous oxide. And those gases, they have different global warming power. I was hesitating between 24 and 28 for methane. It's 28. So 28, methane is 28 times more capacity to retain heat than CO2. And for nitrous oxide, it's 265 times. So we have to take that in account. So I multiply the amount for the global warming power. For CO2 is 1, for methane is 28, and for nitrous oxide is 265. When I multiply that and put everything together, I have the emission factors, that is 8.82 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. So these are the emission factors. Now we know that if we burn 1 gallon of gasoline, depends on what you are using. If you're using in a car or on a motorcycle, you have an amount, a specific amount of kilometers that you can do to that. And you can say that by doing this amount of kilometers, this is the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted in this specific activity. Okay, so the Greenhouse Protocol has proposed to calculate the emissions of organizations in 3 different scopes. I'm not going to detail here, but just to let you know that the scope 1, what we call the first scope, is the emissions that are made directly by the company. That's what we call the scope 1. So everything that is emitted in what the company does by using the vehicles, by transforming any kind of raw material, it's what we call the scope 1. The scope 2 comes from the electricity that the organization uses. So we can calculate the amount of CO2 linked to the production of electricity, as I will show you in an example. And then we have the scope 3. We're talking about all the upstreams and downstream activities of the organization. It can be tricky, it can be complex to calculate it, but we can do that. So those are 3 different scopes, and we get all of them together, we'll have the carbon footprint of organization. This is the kind of exactly the exercise that we do in class with a case study. Okay, so just to put the thing into perspectives, when we're talking about a metric ton of CO2, what are we talking about? This is how you can visualize what is a ton, 1,000 kilograms of CO2. It's roughly the volume of a double-deck bus, right? So this big circle, this big ball represents 1 ton of CO2 under the sea level pressure and 25 degrees Celsius of temperature, right? This is the real definition. So putting things into perspective, this is the amount of balls, of tons of CO2 that is emitted by the city of Newark in one day. We're talking roughly about 140 1,000 tons of CO2 in just one day. And you can visualize here the amount of CO2 that is emitted by the city of New York in a whole year. It's more than 50 million tons of CO2. And just to put things into perspective, in 2024, in the world emitted around 40 billion tons of CO2 just in one year. Okay, so this is the idea of what carbon footprint is about. Why is important to calculate that? Because we can take decisions upon how to control it or how to reduce it. So now let me just show you an example of how can we do that? How can we use the idea of carbon footprint and carbon form to calculate the carbon footprint of an activity and thinking about some decisions that we can take based on that calculation. So the exercise here is to calculate the greenhouse emissions from commuting. I'm talking about a specific activity. I'm talking about going from home to work. And I would like to know what are the amount of CO2 that's emitted and what are the options that I can have to reduce the amount of greenhouse that are emitted in this activity of commuting. To do that, let me change the screen here. And we are going to an Excel file. I think that I will share my whole screen. It will be easier. Here. And here we have some data that we can easily find. So I'm living in France and I live from 30 kilometers from my work. I do 100 per day. So going back and forth, it will be 60 kilometers. And let me see what are the greenhouse emissions linked to some options of doing this activity every day. If I use a car, no, I can use a car in which the fuel is diesel or gasoline. Here in France, we have this ESP95. No? And I have here the emission factors. Those emission factors we can find on different databases. My source here is a database of ADEME, which is the French the French agency for the environment. And they calculated and they said that when we burn 1 kilogram of diesel, when you use a car, an average car, and you run for 1 kilometer, the amount of CO2 linked to this movement of 1 kilometer is 0.147 kilograms of CO2. If you do that with a gasoline car, the amount is 0.16 kilograms for every kilometer. So the idea is quite simple. I have the amount of CO2 for every kilometer. I have the distance. The distance here is, let me just show the formula. No? You can see 30 multiplied by 2 because I'm going back and forth. So 60 kilometers. I multiply 60 kilometers by the emission factor. And I multiply that as well for 220 days per month. I'm taking off the weekends and the holidays. So we have roughly 220 working days in a year. I multiply that for the amount of days in a year. And what we got? Around 1.9 tons of CO2. So roughly 2 big balls of CO2 is the amount of greenhouse gas or the CO2 equivalent linked to commuting using our car from home to work back and forth every day. If you do that with a car that runs on gasoline, it will be a little bit more. So instead of 1.9, 2.1 tons of CO2. So now I have an idea. I can measure that, and I can thinking about how to reduce it. I can thinking about perhaps I can buy an electrical car. And if I buy an electrical car, what will be the amount of CO2 linked to that? Can you calculate that? Yes, we can. So here I did the calculation The same thing. Now we have an electric car, right? The same parameters, right? But what I need to do, it's the efficiency of that car. I mean, with 1 kilowatt hour of energy, because I'm not using gasoline or diesel anymore, I'm using electricity. So with 1 kilowatt hour of electricity, of electrical energy, uh, how many kilometers I can do? And I looked at that in the database of Ademi, and they gave me 0.18. I need 0.18 kilowatt hours to run 1 kilometer. Okay, my question now is, what is the amount of greenhouse gases that are created, that are emitted when we produce electricity here in France? I can find it, and I have the emission factors of electricity production in France. And the result is that in France, for 1 kilowatt hour of electric energy created, there are 33 grams of greenhouse gas that are emitted. So with those numbers, I can easily calculate the amount of greenhouse that are emitted in one round trip. I have 30 kilometers multiplied by 2 because I'm going back and forth. I have the efficiency for each kilometer, and I multiply that for the emission factors. And what I got something that are, well, if I round it, zero point 0.1 tons of CO2, but the precise figure is 78 kilograms of CO2 equivalent in 1 year. So if you compare with diesel and gasoline, you can see that using electrical car, we have considerable less emissions in the same period. One thing that is interesting, I just want to bring your attention to that, is that I'm using electricity here in France, since I live in France. But let's say that you have the same electric car, but you live in Poland. Why I'm using Poland? Because in Poland, they are hugely dependent on coal to create electricity. So the emission factors linked to the creation of transformation, actually, of coal in electricity implies more emissions. So the emission factor of 1 kilowatt hour of electricity in Poland is 0.7. So it's 700 grams of CO2 equivalent for every kilowatt hour. So if I do the same calculation using electric car, but this car is charged in Poland, the amount of CO2 will be 1.7 tons of CO2 equivalent in 1 year. And then you can say, well, but let's try another thing. If I take the tram, if I take a train, sorry, to go to work, is that possible? Yes, and we can easily calculate that because I can find the emission factors of CO2 equivalent for kilometer using the train here in France. The source came from the train from the French train companies SNCF, and I can just do the same maths. I will multiply the emission factors per kilometer for the amount of kilometers that I do, 60 kilometers back and forth. And what I got is 385 kilograms of CO2 equivalent in 1 year. So now I know what are my options. And I know that it will be 385 kilograms per year if I take the train, 78 kilograms per year if I use an electric car charged in France, and almost roughly 2 tons of CO2 equivalent by using a diesel or gasoline car. Of course, you see that the best option here would be the electrical car, even compared to the train. But there is one caveat here, one thing to pay attention, is that I'm not taking into consideration the amount of CO2 that was emitted for the manufacturing, for the production of the car, right? So it's important as well. You have to take that into account. By using the train, You are not taking into account the amount of CO2 that was linked to the production of the train. Actually, it's almost comprised in the emission factors given by the company. But you'd have to take that into account. But if you're talking about only emissions during the utilization, the use of the car, we calculated that and we got to the conclusion that using electrical car it's more interesting in terms of reducing your carbon footprint. Of course, you can think now about different solutions. You can keep using, for example, your diesel car, but you can, for example, share your car with someone else. So instead of having you, your colleague, taking two cars, you can share. Sometimes you drive your colleague, sometimes your colleague drive you. You can be two, three, four in a car, and you can, like that, reduce your carbon footprint. The idea here is that we can easily, with attention and have good emission factors, calculate that amount of greenhouse gas that are emitted in a specific activity. It will do that for a whole company. It's a process that's a little bit more complicated, but really interesting because we get to an important issue of how calculating that and then thinking about the strategies that we can use to reduce those emissions. So that's what I wanted to present to you today. I hope that it will give you a taste of what we can do in class and the kind of excited discussions that we have in class about the strategies for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you very much and hope to see you next year.